Welcome back to Close Up and our extended conversation with Senator Maggie Hassan. Senator, let's get right back into the action. You played a key role recently in the New Hampshire Democratic Party's presentation to the DNC Rules and Bylaws Committee. Of course, the DNC is considering what the presidential nominating calendar will look like on the Democratic side of things in 2028. You were there in the room. We got to see the presentation. What was your sense, though, of how that committee is receiving New Hampshire's argument, especially given what happened the last time around?
Well, look, New Hampshire's Secretary of State is going to follow the law in 2028, and we will have the first in the nation primary. I hope very much that the DNC is going to decide to sanction it, because I think in addition to it being important to the state of New Hampshire, it's really important to the country. We are the lowest barrier primary state, right? People can come here without a big war chest, without a lot of name ID, without a whole lot of staff, and they can make their case at a grassroots level to people who are used to vetting candidates, asking questions from a variety of different political perspectives and walks of life. And they can start in the North Country, talk to a farmer or somebody who does hospitality up there. They can make their way down. They can stop in Manchester and talk to an advanced manufacturing entrepreneur in Manchester, and they can visit a school, and then they can go out to the seacoast and stop at a union hall. They can do all those things in one day without a big entourage and without a big budget. And at the end of the day, granted, staters are just really great at figuring out whether somebody's a phony or not, and pushing them when they haven't really thought out an idea well. And as President Kennedy said, not only do voters in New Hampshire learn more about candidates gain a lot of understanding and knowledge of what people's real lives are like and what their priorities are, and that makes for better nominees and better presidents. So we made that case to the DNC. We got a lot of questions. We had told them at the very beginning, we're New Hampshire, we ask tough questions, go ahead and ask us tough questions, because we're not relying on tradition here. What we're saying is that there's a real role for New Hampshire in an early window that should include more than one state. We don't think New Hampshire should decide who the nominee is, but we do think it's an important first step to vet them at the most grassroots level before they go on to other states.
Do you think identity politics will be the sort of defining aspect of this again? Because that's what happened back in December of 22.
I think what we know as Democrats is that we have to vet our candidates as strongly as we possibly can. We need to win in 2028 so that we can turn this country around from the most corrupt, chaotic, and outrageously unfair presidency that we have seen, lawless presidency that we have seen in our history. And that means we have to have the capacity in that early primary process with several states to truly vet our candidates and make sure we have the strongest nominee possible. And I think that that's on everyone's mind.
You want to win in 28. Certainly you want to win in 26 and try to reclaim control of the Senate. A lot of that has to do with who the candidates are. There's a lot of focus and discussion on our neighbors to the east, and I was talking about this. We've talked about Maine more than we ever have on Close Up, which is weird. But what are your thoughts on the nominee in Maine, Graham Platner?
Look, there are allegations against Graham Platner that are serious and they deserve scrutiny. I think a lot about the women who came forward recently. That's a very hard thing to do. And the people of Maine need to assess not only those reports, but they also need to see Graham Platner's response to them. That's the kind of pressure that comes with campaigning for a high-profile seat, and they're going to need to assess how he responds to these allegations. But what I also hear from Mainers is that they are also balancing Graham Platner's candidacy with their concern that Susan Collins hasn't stood up to Donald Trump enough, not when it really mattered. Just last week, Republicans had a chance to ban this slush fund that the president has proposed, the $1.8 billion of taxpayer money to pay people who assaulted police officers and the Capitol, right? And they had a chance to stop that. They didn't. That's the kind of thing I'm hearing about from the people of Maine. They ultimately are going to make this decision, and they've got to sort these things out. To be clear, though, do you fully support Graham Platner for U.S. Senate, yes or no? What I've said is I think the people of New Hampshire, of Maine, have a lot to balance, and they ultimately need to make that decision. Is that tattoo, the SS insignia that was on his chest for so many years, is that not disqualifying for you? That is really concerning to me. And again, what I hear from the people of Maine Maine who have to make this decision is that they are balancing his account about that tattoo along with the other allegations. I mean, he's had allegations of anti-Semitism and physical threatening, and those are serious allegations, and people are weighing those against what they tell me their concern about Susan Collins is, which is that she just doesn't stand up to Trump when she really could make a difference.
And the people of Maine will decide, as you say, but your validation could mean a lot along the state line. There are communities that pay attention to what goes on in New Hampshire. Will you campaign for Graham Platner if asked?
You know what? I am going to focus on the New Hampshire race. Right now, I'm very glad I don't live in Maine. I live in New Hampshire. I represent New Hampshire, and we've got a really competitive Senate race here. We've got Chris Pappas, who has a great record of standing up for working families in New Hampshire and has really delivered for working families, for veterans, and will continue to do this work with his focus clearly on how people can work hard to get ahead and stay ahead, stand up to the corruption of this administration. And then you have his likely opponent, Johnny Sununu, has a strong record of standing up for billionaires rather than making sure the economy works for everyone, and has been very supportive of President Trump, particularly, among other things, on the war.
So for a decade, Republicans have been detouring around issues with Trump, and now Democrats are doing the same thing with this guy. Does this erode sort of the moral authority that Democrats are trying to claim in this era when you're stuck with a candidate like this?
Look, we have a candidate who's had serious allegations of anti-Semitism and physical threatening against him. He has responded to those allegations, but at the end of the day, there's also, as I said, the people of Maine say that there's also a character or moral issue about whether you stand up to Trump and how. And I think it is a balance that they will ultimately make. Just as, right now in Texas, the Republicans are putting up Ken Paxton, who was impeached by his own party for ethical violations and referred for prosecution by his own party for ethical violations and had to pay a fine. So I believe character matters, and I believe it matters both in in your personal life, but also in the way you conduct yourself and whether you stand up to wrongdoing.
And as we wrap up here, let's return to some policy issues and something we don't talk often about on CloseUp, which is playlists. It's drawn your attention that Spotify has these fake podcasts that sort of pose as media, but are really actually vehicles to sell prescription drug, opioids, things like that. What's going on here, and how do you stop it?
Well, look, we saw news reports that there were these kind of pretextual podcasts on Spotify that were being used to sell illicit drugs, for instance, to listeners, including young people, right? And so we sent Spotify a letter. We asked them to talk to us about what they knew about this. They have now responded that they have found 57,000 instances of content that is embedded in these podcasts that is illegal or harmful in some way. They say they have removed 57,000 of these podcasts or instances, but they haven't reported them to law enforcement. And this is a part of an overall effort we're making on the Joint Economic Committee, where I'm the lead Democrat, to really go after scams, but also really talk to the various platforms out there about what they're doing to make sure that their platforms aren't being used for illicit purposes. And in many cases, we're finding that the platforms could do a lot more, and they really should.
Yeah, Spotify was saying we didn't monetize this, but that's passing muster for you.
Yeah, no, that's not passing muster at all. So we will continue to investigate these instances on Spotify, how it happened, what Spotify can do to prevent that from happening. We're just pushing these platforms to understand that as they make a lot of money off of the service they provide, they have an obligation to make sure that scammers, illicit drug dealers aren't using their platforms to do real harm.
All right. Senator Maggie Hassan, thanks for joining us on CloseUp.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.
And we'll be right back with a busy week at the State House, transitioning from governing to campaigning as the summer approaches.